would you view the home as a parallel to like sort of the nation state in a sense where power dictates who speaks, who is erased?
Yeah, I mean, of course. And I think, I kind of don't want to make that comparison because there are obvious dangers to that kind of an allegorization of home. But it's a material space. It's an extremely powered space. It's a gendered space. It's a classed space. And I think in the context of the subcontinent, it's also a very castized space, right? So the women are the ones who are preserving the caste norms of touchability, of culinary purity, what kind
Mhm.
of food should be eaten when, what kind of food is pure and should be kept or should not be kept in contact with actual bodies or other food items. So in some ways, women's domestic labor uh, retains the status quo, retains the conservative nature of the subcontinental homes.
How do you how do you see domestic spaces in terms of the city in your poetry?
Um, I mean, so women are asked to spend their lives in the homes, right? So for a
Yeah.
lot of women, and I do write about that more in the volume I'm working on. So for a lot of the women, the city kind of comes through the windows or the terraces or the short walks they take uh, when
Yeah.
they are out to to go shopping, to run errands. But it's never really the city in its entirety, right? So you
Yeah.
rarely see women, say, after 9 or so, in of the major cities in the subcontinent, a group of women or even a mixed group who are hanging out in the street, um, engaged in some kind of adebasi, right? So in
Hmm.
the tea shops, the universities are a little bit different because the universities are like homes. They're problematic institutions, but at the same time, for 3 to 5 years of their lives, women might experience some amount of relative openness. They can experience, for example, sitting in a tea shop with their male friends, with male classmates, chit chatting. But other than that, tea shops are close to women. And I think it's also something you grow up with as a middle class woman. It's not like people would actually kick you out. It's not like you would get ripped immediately when you sit down for a cup of tea in the in a tea shop, but it's a sensor that's inbuilt in your mind that that's not my space. So the city is not my space. I cannot access every bits and parts of the city. So in some ways, home or those kind of, that fragmented view of the city is what
Yeah.
a woman's city is. And it's extremely
Hmm.
difficult to write about precisely because the city kind of demands to be experienced in its entirety. But then also, you can possibly say the same thing about class, right? That especially cities are always unequal. So, what are the spaces which are completely close to working class men? And I think in the post liberalization era, more and more South Asian cities are closing themselves off to poor working class populations of any gender. So, who are the increasing number of coffee shops for? Um, so in also a lot of middle class women, they do find a certain kind of idea of safe space in the kind of this new style coffee shops, right? But at the same time, are these coffee shops equally open to the working class women, to the lower middle class women? Obviously not. To what extent
Hmm.
these cafes are open to the workers without any
Yeah.
union rights, working for wages which are literally below living wage, below poverty line, um, who are working in these cafes. So, in some ways, the
Yeah.
cities are always fragmented spaces, and they are becoming even more so in the subcontinent.
Yeah. absolutely.
And it's glaring, right?
And
I mean, I think that compared to an American city, you don't see, I mean, of course, American cities are deeply unequal too, but you don't feel that inequality until and unless you are really looking for it. But in South Asia, I mean, in South Asia, everything, I mean, you cannot actually, if you're a middle class person in South Asia, uh, you would be faced with your own complicity every single day, even if you are just trying to live, you are struggling in your own life, right? So I mean, it's almost always in fragments.
yeah, so I want to discuss on the future of radical poetics. Uh, you write, poetry does nothing, poetry changes nothing, yet a world where no poems are being written is inherently unlivable. That is like a tension a lot of poets wrestle with. Does poetry intervene, or is its power in its refusal to intervene? Where do you land on this?
Yeah, I mean, I will try not to be too pessimistic, right? So
Yeah.
my natural inclination is to say that there is no, I don't see any possibility of any real radical poetics emerging in the subcontinent anytime soon. Um, Precisely because radical poetics and radical art depends upon radical movements and the
Yeah.
fate of the radical movements in South Asia. As you know, it's not very hope inducing, right? Um, Rather, we are seeing the
Yeah.
death of uh, certain kinds of radicalisms, the 20th century radicalisms, and no other positive radicalisms are being born. The radicalisms that are
Yeah.
being born are really right wing radicalisms.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, I also would,
And the left wing radicalisms are.
yeah, I mean, I would try not to act during this session, not to go into my usual pessimistic rants about the leftists in South Asia. Let's reserve that for an off camera where we are not being
Yeah.
very neutral. But at the same time, I think that we actually have a lot of work to do in the subcontinent in order to build up viable left radical movements or even left democratic movements, right? Um, so, and I don't see that happening. But at the same time, I want to retain my sense of hope that something would happen uh, out of all the confusion, something would happen, and we are trying to do certain things, and these conversations matter. So in the same way, I think in terms of the radical poetics, I would not say that nothing is being done. There are things that are being written, there are things that are being done, but I do think that the neoliberal appropriation of radical poetics, of radical art, it's a threat. And it's a threat that didn't quite exist for the 20th century radical artists in the same way. So we actually have to think about the market and the market's power to appropriate all kinds of radical thought, and through that appropriation, de radicalize the content. And in a way, I think a lot of the fascisms, uh, they kind of in the work in weird ways, right? So it
Mhm.
becomes almost impossible for the market to actually retain the neoliberal appropriation while they're also keen on working with the fascist governments, while they're also trying to work with the religious right wing. And we are seeing that throughout the subcontinent, in whatever forms the religious fundamentalisms come in our respective societies. And at the end of the day, what we're also seeing that religious fundamentalisms, irrespective of whatever religion they're holding on to, they speak in like surprisingly similar languages, right? The kind of the
Yeah.
details
Absolutely.
might differ from each other, but it's almost like they are having clandestine conversations amongst each other, like, within their own organizations in the way you and I are talking to each other. So I think that in some ways, I also want to retain the hope that something would emerge, but I do think we need to be really, really aware and cautious about the market's ability to appropriate radical poetics. And also, I would say that, who am I to kind of claim that high ground? In another 5 years, you might see me being appropriated by the market. So it's not necessarily about the individual, but it's about the process. But we need to keep talking about this process.